2. The conflict. After the Euro-American War, there occurred first a century of minor national conflicts, and then a century of strained peace during which America and China became more and more irksome to each other. At the close of this period, the great mass of men were, in theory, far more cosmopolitan than nationalists, yet the inveterate tribal spirit lurked within each mind, and was ever ready to take possession. The planet was now a delicately organised economic unit, and big business in all lands was emphatically contemptuous of patriotism. Indeed, the whole adult generation of the period was consciously and without reserve internationalist and pacifist. Yet this logically unassailable conviction was undermined by a biological craving for adventurous living. Prolonged peace and improved social conditions had greatly reduced the danger and hardship of life, and there was no socially harmless substitute to take the place of war in exercising the primitive courage and anger of animals fashioned for the wild. Consciously, men desired peace. Unconsciously, they still needed some such gallantry as war afforded, and this repressed combative disposition ever and again expressed itself in explosions of irrational tribalism. Inevitably, a serious conflict at last occurred. As usual, the cause was both economic and sentimental. The economic cause was the demand for fuel. A century earlier, a very serious oil famine had so sobered the race that the League of Nations had been able to impose a system of cosmopolitan control upon the existing oil fields, and even the coal fields. It had also imposed strict regulation as to the use of these invaluable materials. Oil in particular was only to be used for enterprises in which no other source of power would serve. The cosmopolitan control of fuel was perhaps the supreme achievement of the League, and it remained a fixed policy of the race long after the League had been superseded. Yet, by a choice irony of fate, this quite unusually sane policy contributed largely to the downfall of civilization. By means of it, as will later transpire, the end of coal was postponed into the period when the intelligence of the race was so deteriorated that it could no longer cope with such a crisis. Instead of adjusting itself to the novel situation, it simply collapsed. But at the time with which we are at present dealing, means had recently been found of profitably working the huge deposits of fuel in Antarctica. This vast supply unfortunately lay technically beyond the jurisdiction of the World Fuel Control Board. America was first in the field, and saw in Antarctic fuel a means for her advancement and for her self-imposed duty of Americanizing the planet. China, fearful of Americanization, demanded that the new sources should be bought under the jurisdiction of the board. For some years, feeling had become increasingly violent on this point, and both peoples had by now relapsed into the crude old nationalistic mood. War began to seem almost inevitable. The actual occasion of conflict, however, was, as usual, an accident. A scandal was brought to light about child labour in certain Indian factories. Boys and girls under 12 were being badly sweated, and in their abject state, their only adventure was precocious sex. The American government protested, and in terms which assumed that America was the guardian of the world's morals. India immediately held up the reform which she had begun to impose, and replied to America as to a busybody. America threatened an expedition to set things right, backed by the approval of all the morally sensitive races of the earth. China now intervened to keep the peace between her rival and her partner, and undertook to see that the evil should be abolished if America would withdraw her extravagant slanders against the Eastern conscience. But it was too late. An American bank in China was raided, and its manager's severed head was kicked along the street. The tribes of men had once more smelled blood. War was declared by the West upon the East. Of the combatants, Asia with North Africa formed geographically the more compact system, but America and her dependents were economically more organised. At the outbreak of war, neither side had any appreciable armament, for war had long ago been outlawed. This fact, however, made little difference, since the warfare of the period could be carried on with great effect simply by the vast swarms of civil aircraft, loaded with poisons, high explosive, disease microbes, and the still more lethal hypobiological organisms, which contemporary science sometimes regarded as the simplest living matter, sometimes as the most complex molecules. The struggle began with violence, slackened, and dragged on for a quarter of a century. At the close of this period, Africa was mostly in the hands of America, but Egypt was an uninhabitable no man's land, for the South Africans had very successfully poisoned the sources of the Nile. Europe was under Chinese military rule. This was enforced by armies of sturdy Central Asiatics, who were already beginning to wonder why they did not make themselves masters of China also. The Chinese language with European alphabet was taught in all schools. In England, however, there were no schools and no population, for early in the war an American airbase had been established in Ireland, and England had been repeatedly devastated. Airmen passing over what had been London could still make out the lines of Oxford Street and the Strand among the green and grey tangle of ruins. Wild nature, once so jealously preserved in national beauty spots against the incursion of urban civilization, now rioted over the whole island. At the other side of the world, the Japanese islands had been similarly devastated in the vain American effort to establish there an air base from which to reach the heart of the enemy. So far, however, neither China nor America had been very seriously damaged. But recently the American biologists had devised a new malignant germ, more infectious and irresistible than anything hitherto known. Its work was to disintegrate the highest levels of the nervous system, and therefore to render all who were even slightly affected incapable of intelligent action, while a severe attack caused paralysis, and finally death. With this weapon, the American military had already turned one Chinese city into a bedlam, and wandering bacilli had got into the brains of several high officials throughout the province, rendering their behaviour incoherent. It was becoming the fashion to attribute all one's blunders to a touch of the new microbe. Hitherto, no effective means of resisting the spread of this plague had been discovered, and, as in the early stages of the disease, the patient became restlessly active, undertaking interminable and objectless journeys on the flimsiest pretexts. It seemed probable that the American madness would spread throughout China. On the whole, then, the military advantage lay definitely with the Americans, but economically they were perhaps the more damaged, for their higher standard of prosperity depended largely on foreign investment and foreign trade. Throughout the American continent there was now real poverty and serious symptoms of class war, not indeed between private workers and employers, but between workers and the autocratic military governing caste which inevitably war had created. Big business had at first succumbed to the patriotic fever, but had soon remembered that war is folly and ruinous to trade. Indeed, upon both sides the fervour of nationalism had lasted only a couple of years, after which the lust of adventure had given place to mere dread of the enemy. For on each side the populace had been nursed into the belief that its foe was diabolic. When a quarter of a century had passed since there had been free intercourse between the two peoples, the real mental difference which had always existed between them appeared to many almost as a difference of biological species. Thus in America the Church preached that no Chinaman had a soul. Satan, it was said, had tampered with the evolution of the Chinese race when first it had emerged from the pre-human animal. He had contrived that it should be cunning, but wholly without tenderness. He had induced in it an insatiable sensuality and wilful blindness toward the divine, toward that superbly masterful energy for energy's sake which was the glory of America. Just as in a prehistoric era the young race of mammals had swept away the sluggish, brutish and demoted reptiles, so now, it was said, young, soulful America was destined to rid the planet of the reptilian Mongol. In China, on the other hand, the official view was that the Americans were a typical case of biological regression. Like all parasitic organisms, they had thriven by specialising in one low-grade mode of behaviour at the expense of their higher nature, and now, tapeworms of the planet, they were starving out the higher capacities of the human race by their frantic acquisitiveness. Such were the official doctrines, but the strain of war had latterly produced on each side a grave distrust of its own government and an emphatic will for peace at any price. The governments now hated the peace party even more than each other, since their existence now depended on war. They even went so far as to inform one another of the clandestine operations of the pacifists discovered by their own secret service in enemy territory. Thus, when at last big business and the workers on each side of the Pacific had determined to stop the war by concerted action, it was very difficult for their representatives to meet.